Hey, William. Good to see you. For those of you that don't realize, William's part of our board of directors for Natural Areas Association, and he's great to work with. And I'm in the state where he alluded to. He used to work in Arkansas. I'm with Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, the Fish and Wildlife Regulatory Agency here. Kelly, I have friends with Minnesota DNR in the fish division, um, and I love to go fishing in Minnesota. Try to every year. Um, uh, I just wanted to take part in this conversation because we, and I think we can say throughout the fish and wildlife world, are trying to do more and more with public-private partnerships and partnerships in general. And in Arkansas, we just, for whatever reason, we happen to be really good at it. And people that come to our state from with National Wildlife Federation, any entity like that, and see the things we do in conservation through partnership, folks tend to be amazed. I don't know why that is, but we just seem to be good at it. Maybe it's out of necessity, but it's a topic that I find very fascinating and rewarding, just in general. So nice to be part of the discussion.
Great, Daryl. Great to see you again. Carol Spurrier.
Okay, let's see. Yeah. Oh, hi, William.
Hey, Carol, how are you? Good to see you
I'm
again.
good. Yes. So I'm Carol Spurrier. I'm an ecologist at the Forest Service. I work on the same staff that William works on. I've been with the Forest Service for about 5 years now. And I was interested in this conversation and seeing if there's interest beyond the traditional partners that we have with shared stewardship contracts into increasing into other state government agencies and things like that. So that's why I'm here.
Great, Carol. Great to have you all here. And so again, the Steward Circle, the topic is collaborative approaches to conservation, public-private partnerships. And so I'd like to open the session, see if any one of you have a question that would like to bring to the table and start the discussion.
I'll chime in if you don't mind. I think collaboration, at least for us here in Minnesota, is super important in order to get people to want to follow the kind of things that we're doing, to be able to get a better product in the end, right? If you're doing, for our purposes, like doing outreach and trying to get people involved, you want people that can come in and feel like they're doing something good. For us, it's mainly volunteers doing stewardship events. We have like seed collections and invasive species removals and things like that. And working with others to do that, not only do you get the buy-in, you get more done too. We also have a few nonprofits here, at least in the metro area of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, that do work with us. They'll come out with their groups and do work on our sites. So we're getting more bang for our buck by having that collaborative approach to doing that particular kind of work. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I'll chime in just because I may be the only private person here. So we're a private nonprofit, and I think what we bring, and the reason that the organization was created, was to provide kind of a cohesive management vision and approach across multiple landowners within this ecosystem in Orange County. And I think that it does seem to me that even though there's been a lot of growth and capacity among the public agencies over the years in terms of their ability to manage, they still, just because of capacity constraints, don't have the kind of number of people or even are able to leverage the same kind of resources that we're able to. And so, our value add is kind of doing a comprehensive approach that includes everything from, restoration to land management to, public engagement and, running the volunteer program for the county. So I think there's just a lot of we don't have the same kind of constraints, but we also don't own any land. And so I think one thing that's kind of interesting from our perspective is just that when it comes down to it, we're still sort of a contractor, and that feels a little bit tenuous, but in terms of, the value that we bring. But in a really complex kind of regulatory environment like Southern California, I think there's some value in having those private partners.
Great.
As a seed company, we do restoration work in the Great Basin, Sierras, and Mojave. And just a simple sample of what we're up to is, for instance, the Tahoe Basin. And if we have a linear disturbance up there that's related to a road or a utility line, or even a ski resort of large acreage, we're dealing with local TRPA agencies, the federal government through the BLM and the Forest Service, through the cities, 5 counties, 2 states, and they all have sometimes contradictory programming specifications. And for us to sort out seed blends and techniques for doing disturbance repairs, we have to get all these people in the same table, and a lot of times they aren't. And so that is one of the bigger challenges of us doing our job. And the end product is to send out a bag of seed that keeps everybody happy to a contractor that's going to know what he's doing when it comes to restoration work. And it's all over the board. All our jobs seem to be like that. So the cooperation is in your face all the time.
Interesting. Daryl, you like to chime in from state level experience or approach?
Sure. I think from our perspective, it's kind of interesting. Arkansas Game and Fish Commission is actually, you may not realize, one of the, we don't have funding problems that a lot of state agencies like us have due to a number of factors, but mainly because we have a conservation sales tax that was passed a little over 20 years ago that creates good revenue for us and gives us some accountability to non-consumptive users. It's a nice thing we have going. Us and the state of Missouri are the only 2 states I know of that have this sort of funding mechanism that supplements our fishing and hunting sales, license sales, along with the federal taxes that go on things relating to that. So the point being, even with that, we've learned that, the limitation for almost everything is funding, and we can stretch our dollars so much farther if we just partner. And especially when you go into private sector and nonprofits, we're just doing more of it all the time. And the people that are benefiting are the people of Arkansas, because so much good conservation is going on here, because we just keep working that model harder and harder, stretching our state dollars more and more. In the last set, I'll just note that it's actually kind of fascinating. The last session I was in was an invasive species discussion in that stewardship circle. And someone, without going into detail, the conversation went to COVID and COVID causing people to go outdoors more. And this isn't really a partnership thing, but us and our partners are seeing, at least in Arkansas, a very interesting reaction to COVID is that our funding is now dramatically increased. More people are recreating outside, more people are fishing and hunting this year, and our agency right now is about $0.1 million above last year at this same time in our cash budget right now. Part of that equation is, so this discussion is that us and our partners around the state have been, saw this coming really early on, and we've actually marketed to it. And we've had help in that with the Nature Conservancy and other partners. So it's been really interesting, and kind of brings the discussion right home right now. It's an interesting twist on partnerships, and that us and our partners have been able to market and promote conservation because of COVID, because people are paying attention to the outdoors more of late.
Interesting.
Speaking of COVID, our sales to homeowners and to nurseries wholesale to homeowners is 300% year to date, because everybody's staying home, rediscovering their inner gardening selves, and going to town on their real estate. It's a wonderful phenomenon, because a lot of the urban growth in Reno is mandated to be very low water consumptive landscaping. We actually call it urban reclamation, because it's somewhat similar in the species group that we use for doing landscaping on industrial work. But homeowners are jumping on remaking their yards to be, yes, more water consumptive, less water consumptive because of the mandates from local jurisdictions. But it's all been maybe a lovely silver lining of a horrible epidemic.
Carol, would you like to share?
So one of the things I was thinking is that in the agency, we tend to be moving toward larger landscape scale projects and restorations, and it only makes sense to try to find partners across jurisdictions within those landscapes, and to try to figure out priority areas and definite priorities for the kind of work we need to be doing with a lot of partners. So that's what I was thinking there.
Right, thank you. So we'll agree that, or to a certain degree, that partnerships are important, right? So we look at the example that Daryl shared, and the other thing I would like to say is collaboration partnerships. They have different sizes and shapes. So Kelly mentioned the volunteer work, right? I can imagine that some of that volunteer work to some degree is a very localized scale, right? And going to then Nathan, right, and Ed. So the type of work that you're doing varies. And I remember, so the work that we did in Arkansas, we were actually looking at landscapes that were hundreds of thousands of acres, right? And not only federal, but we were looking at state, private, federal landscapes. So looking at what makes sense. And again, the example that Carol shared, right? Looking at what makes sense for your collaborative and working at that landscape. I would like to ask then the group, what challenges have you seen when you go into the business of collaborative conservation?
I'm ready for this one.
Right, yes.
Sorry, I was going to keep it going. I mean, again, like we're not, we're at the tens of thousands of acres scale, not the hundreds of thousands. So, we're working within the urban wildland interface, and it has its own sort of set of issues. But across the three, just focusing on the land management stuff for the public open space, we've got 3 different entities with 3 different sets of policies and 3 different sets of levels of engagement and priorities for that matter. We're also working within this federal NCCP, HCP reserve framework. And so that comes with its own set of obligations and a whole nother set of partners. But one of the challenges, like as a case study, one of the challenges we ran into was an anti-synthetic herbicide campaign and set of policies. And one of our jurisdictions within the city that really limited what we're able to do in terms of invasive species control. And in Southern California, that's a really, really tough challenge. And so in terms of what that meant and in our overall approach, like we really had to make a lot of changes and have seen, a lot of kind of challenges that go along with that. And so where we were trying to sort of apply this, cohesive, comprehensive, framework across all of our acreage, we ran into this problem where we're, seeing particular challenges that we really are kind of limited politically in like terms of what we can address. And so I find like that policy environment is an important thing to evaluate when we're talking about how we get our work done. The second thing, not to kind of throw it too far off, but I would really be interested in your all perspective about this, is that when we're trying to do regional coordination, because since we are working on behalf of the landowners and we're sort of, we're the managing entity, we're part of all these, regional and statewide conversations about the major things, whether it's fire prevention, invasive species control, setting prioritization, around, where we might do restoration or, dealing with emerging threats, things like that. What I find the most difficult is when you kind of start to bring all these different public agencies together, who takes the lead in the actual implementation coordination? Because at some point it starts to break down when we get sort of beyond those boundaries. And, we as a, relatively small nonprofit with, again, like we're participating in conversations, but we're not working at that scale. And so, what our role is in terms of leadership, I find a really interesting question in terms of like what we can do to convene, but also like who's really out there to set the strategy, because we don't have we don't see the same kind of federal leadership I think that you all are talking about in like Minnesota and in other parts of the West where there's a lot more federal land. Here we're responsible to the state, the federal and state wildlife agencies, but we don't have a large federal landowner outside of the Forest Service. But again, they've got their own kind of set of parcels to manage, and so it's been a really interesting problem to sort of how do you get past that barrier of leadership and direction setting. There's lots of good conversations happening, but in terms of what action actually looks like is very different.
Right. Anyone else about what barriers to collaborative conservation do you see or have experienced?
Yeah, I'd echo what Nathan was talking about from that state perspective. Same frustration, and at least that last part you were speaking to, that's where I think is the biggest hurdle, is getting people, individuals in state agency work in this case. Hang on, my computer's trying to restart right now. Okay. Everybody, there's a very strong tendency with state government employees to stick to the mission and not go beyond it. It's not my job. And in partnership, you're often trying to get people to look past those missions and stray from it a little bit to pull off the conservation that you're trying to get done. And to me, that's the biggest hurdle. I can relate exactly to what Nathan's talking about from the other side of the fence. And all the time when we're trying to conduct some sort of a conservation project, one of the issues is who is the lead, and you're trying not to step on each other's toes. And at the same time, you're trying to move the effort forward. And maybe if you need to, we need to establish the lead. So it kind of gets into even individual egos, state agency philosophies and culture. And a lot of times that is one of the biggest barriers to a good partnership. And again, for whatever reason, in this state, we just tend to have an easy time getting past all that. One of the main players in making that happen in Arkansas is we're very fortunate to have a really strong chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and that's a great example of a nonprofit that helps in a sensitive way establish lead on projects and get us agency folks to cooperate. They do a really, really good job. As an example of one nonprofit that's very important in this state.
Others care to add to the barriers or challenges to collaboration?
We always have barriers, and we expect them when we're dealing with projects that are interstate. And typically that's with a utility corridor. But we even have the same conceptual issues within a state. And a perfect example would be the multiple districts of Caltrans in the state of California. All have different practicing managements and personalities. And the contrast between them, we have to learn each district and their personality and know which hoops and who to jump through with. But for them, whenever we can see them together in a meeting or a group of highway people, that's when they get to see from us what they actually are, and that is they are a group of contrasting folks. And there's rationales for the differences in how they approach our work, but also they can realize that in some respects, they should be a little more in line with each other to keep the operations that we have to be expeditious with being expeditious. And for most of the arid land work that we do, we're focused in late fall work that's up against weather and timing and issues of logistics and long distance and rural work. And so all of this needs to be advanced planned. And so we're always up front dealing with those challenges to make sure that when fall comes, which is right now, we're in our crunch season, that everything is going smooth and fast. But yeah, it's always a challenge.
So
Egos are big time.
yeah, Ed, I'm curious, in a situation like that, do you meet with each district individually, or do they get together at one point, big meeting? What's the process?
Well, for us, there's the ecological parameters. I deal with the Sierras and the Mojave Desert in California and the Modoc. And so we're dealing with the higher elevation, more the arid land districts. And so I'm not interested in all the districts in the state because I don't know what they do in Monterey or LA.
Yeah.
And so I'm more focused on any gatherings or groups of folks that are dealing with the botanical products that we deal in. And so we're limited somewhat in that respect. But those groups, we still would like to have more uniform playing field with when we deal with them. But, you know, I've been 30 years in the business now, and one of our biggest challenges is that agencies change hands, people retire, newbies come in the line, political winds of change every election. They all play in the budgets that are reflected by those changes. They all play into us always having to be on our toes.
Yeah, many challenges. Kelly, how about you?
I was trying to think about that. I had a couple of thoughts. Maybe I could quickly on the small scale part of it in doing sort of the volunteer events and things like that. When you're working with a partner on doing things, it's that coordination can be sometimes an issue, like making sure that you take the time every year to sit down in person and say, what are we going to do this year? What are our goals for, you know, seed collections or invasive removals? Who's going to be doing what? And from our perspective, you know, they're doing a lot of the work on state lands. So, you know, we sometimes have to sort of be the guy with the big stick saying, no, we're going to do it this way. You know, so that kind of thing. But that's not usually, it hasn't been as much of a challenge for us. The other idea I was thinking about was on a statewide level, we have an easement program with prairie landowners, private landowners who have native prairie on their land. And our coordinator of that program has been really, really interested in getting a group together to just like talk about what's going well. A group meaning a group of landowners, right? Getting landowners together and say what's going well and what's not, and you know, where can I get help to, you know, do a prescribed burn or whatever it might be. And so she was trying to figure out how to basically lead from behind. And what ended up coming out of it was working with a lot of her partners in other state agencies, nonprofits, and individual landowners that she knew that could start a group. What they ended up doing is creating a Facebook group, and it's run by like I think it's a federal office out of somewhere in rural Minnesota, you know, southeast or southwestern Minnesota, and that was the person that put it together. But the intent is having anyone who's interested in prairie that owns land that has prairie on it to do stuff together. The challenge is trying to lead from behind, right? We don't want it to be, for us, just our program focused. We don't want it to be just like, oh, look at all the things that we can do for you as a landowner. We want the landowners to be asking us the questions, and sometimes getting that engagement is the bottom line. It can be the problem. So that was off the top of my head.
Yeah. So I actually, that's a very interesting situation because I know that the state of Arkansas has several programs at least for forested land, where they have foresters that they're paid to actually go out and ask the landowner, what do you want? Right there, and so it's a different situation. You go out and you try to identify what are their needs. Not necessarily a collaborative approach, right? It's just a
Right.
customer based. Um, However, it can become a collaborative project if you then identify enough folks that want to work on a specific objective. And one thing I can think of that I've experienced with looking at barriers is how we individual entities manage funding and priorities, right? Because in some cases, um, we can spend funding, however, there are conditions. So federal government, right, depending which agency we're talking about, they have limitations to where the money is spent. And when I was handling or leading the collaborative forest landscape restoration project, Congress said, we'll give you the money, but the money has to be spent on federal land. And you need collaborators, right? So that for some people is a hard sell, right? Because it's essentially we identify this landscape. I need other people to come on board to help me do work, but the money cannot be spent outside of federal boundaries. So that's to some degree a challenge or a barrier to getting people on board. Now, the great thing about the particular project that I worked with was that 10, 15 years earlier, the scientific community, the state, private, nonprofit, and federal identified that there is a big issue. And it was, we were losing hardwoods, right? Was it, Daryl, right? The issue with the hardwoods, because we were not burning hardwoods enough. And so we got together, we had a 2-day meeting with scientists, listening to landowners, and came up with objectives. And that was that. And it took, I don't know, 10 years later for CFLR to come on board, and Congress said, hey, if you have a landscape, you have objectives. And we're like, yeah, we have. We even have something in place with objectives and procedures and science behind. And it takes people actually looking at this and then realizing, what about private land? Who can actually help the private landowners? And that's NRCS. Actually, that's what they do. They actually put money into grants, and landowners do the work. And so we took advantage of that in Arkansas with the Joint Chief. And then what we did is, okay, we have this large landscape where we want to conserve water. If we implement conservation practices, we're going to improve the amount and quality of water. But we cannot do this alone. We need to include the private landowner. So we created priority areas and then brought those landowners to implement conservation practices. So that's how we deal with that challenge. Like Daryl said, who's the lead? That's always a challenge. And having a nonprofit, and I will say also nonprofit or a non-government organization that is highly respected helps a lot, right? So in our case, Nature Conservancy is highly respected, and they do a lot of good work in Arkansas. For us, it's a non-brainer. We had at the time a process where no one really is the lead, right? We are all equal. We get together when we need to. And by the way, Nature Conservancy has the connections. Yeah, they can put the meeting together. They run with that. They put the meeting together. We get people on the around the table, and that's how we did or overcame those challenges. So that's very interesting. And so I want to ask the group then, how do you set up priorities?
In our valley, the Nature Conservancy has a very big footprint with the river restorations in the Carson River and up in Reno with the Truckee River. And we do a lot of work with them on riparian restoration. And their focus has been on lands, large chunks of land that are in critical places like river confluences or places along the Truckee where there's a lot more activity going on for the future. But I every now and then ponder when you look at a picture of the watershed of our valley, there's the tentacles of smaller river portions that tie into larger portions, and it's a very decentralized sort of view of where restoration could be occurring. And the Conservancy has done a very good job of working on critical places that are really important. But when you look at the whole picture, for us working on a watershed is a waste of time if we're not looking at the entire watershed. A little piece here, a little piece there, and then there's big flood events or storm events or developments. And so likewise with restoration in a more subtle way, all of the agricultural valley that has distorted the watershed in our valley and the pollutants and the weeds and everything else, they all need to have a representative at the table that's not just doing the big spots. And I know the Conservancy can appreciate that viewpoint of watershed restoration. It's the same for everything we do at Lake Tahoe. There's 17 watersheds and they all end up at a delta along the lake somewhere, spewing what they do into the lake. And so the bigger picture somehow would love to have a Conservancy activity that sort of plays an umbrella on the diffused, decentralized part of the watershed versus just that focal point.
We get most of our work done and, oh, sorry, Joe, that's something. Just done kind of at the task force committee level. So it really depends on the scale at which we're talking about. Like I said, we work within primarily within this NCCP HCCP reserve, and we actually took over essentially the role that Nature Conservancy had historically played here when the land was first being set aside for conservation. They still have some easement rights, but so if we're talking about sort of setting countywide priorities or priorities within the reserve, we have kind of a framework in which to work. It gets more complicated as we move out and are talking about statewide issues or like in the case of, we have emerging tree pest issues that stretch from like San Diego County all the way up through LA County. And so when you get that level of people going on, that's where there's a lot of coordination in terms of, how do we treat these things, how do we map them, that kind of thing. But in terms of like how resources are distributed, it's a lot less clear. Yeah, and then like to Ed's point before about Caltrans, we had the same thing with Cal Fire where depending on where you are in the state, fire behaves very differently and the policies that are set up are very different. So how funding gets distributed then really kind of depends on the biases of the individual agencies. So there it's just really about, trying to get people, on the same Zoom call or in the same room and sharing information and trying to kind of educate. But again, we always still run into this problem of like, who ultimately has the authority to set a plan and get things done, or even the capacity to really do it at that level. So, but it really comes down to just kind of having good relationships and open conversation. And it really happens kind of not at that very high level, but at the kind of practitioner implementer level, I think is where we get the most done.
Thank you. Anyone else on the topic of setting priorities and with the collaborative approach?
Sometimes priorities are set through controversy and conflict. And especially for agency folks, that's often how things begin. And the beauty of it is you can take those occasions, if you do things right, use collaboration and partnerships to turn the whole thing into a positive. We have a great example over the last few years. Arkansas has the river that was the first river established as a national river, the Buffalo River. Should be a pristine watershed in the Ozarks, karst topography, heavily groundwater influenced. Water quality has always been high. We've seen water quality degraded over the last few years, and coincidentally, one confined animal unit hog farm went in on one tributary, and even though that unit wasn't helping the situation at all, the entire watershed was not falling victim to poor water quality due to that hog farm. But it became a huge, huge controversy. The way we do things in Arkansas, again, what it's led to is, I'll shorten the whole story to the hog farm is now gone. The environmental grassroots groups that were created as a result of the controversy are now part of a bigger partnership, and we've turned it into an NRCS RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership, where now we have a lot of groups in partnership working on the bigger picture problems of declining water quality in the Buffalo National River. So in terms of this discussion, the priority was set because of controversy and a perceived villain that wasn't necessarily there, but it gave us the opportunity to highlight the bigger problem and create a very positive mechanism to do it. And that RCPP now has got the county governments involved in that watershed, and we've created a pot of money and an entire focus for private landowners to benefit from, to draw from a pool of money using our work as match, us agency partners, and good things are going to happen.
Anything, I see that we are 15 minutes from the end of the Stewards Circle. I want to make sure that we are addressing some of the individual challenges that you're dealing with. So I would like to open up the floor for anything in particular that you would like to ask the group.
Yeah, am I the only one that's actually working in the office?
I'm in my office.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Our office is on our farm. I commute all the way from the house to the barn.
Excellent, excellent, Ed. Excellent.
Good COVID place.
As a result of COVID, our agency came up with a new flexible policy. We can work from home or we can work from the office, and I prefer the office. But I still find it fascinating with Zoom now being the format for all this interaction. Almost everybody looks to be at home. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, I'll just throw it out there for the state of Minnesota. All of our government work, all of our workers are still required to be working from home. And we actually just had an email this week that says, plan to be at home indefinitely. They're not letting us back into our buildings.
Wow.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, like this came up just as you asked that question, William, because like that's been a big, COVID has been a really big challenge in terms of continuing those regional partnership level conversations. Like with the landowners that we, contract with directly, like we have these conversations and have been developing our policies and things with them. But again, everybody's doing something different and has different priorities. And so like the city of Irvine, who we work with, was really concerned early on about public unrest, and they pushed hard to have self-guided, access on the open space again. But they didn't, and then they then were able, like comfortable kind of allowing other activities, whereas the county had a whole different level of restrictions that they're going on. And so we have kind of different things happening on different parts of the open space that we manage. And while we've been pretty successful of being able, because we have so many people based in the field, that we've been able to kind of, at least within our offices, make sure people can get in and out safely. But what I've noticed is what really fell apart were all the regional meetings and conversations that we had, just because everybody suddenly became very inwardly focused in terms of, worrying about their own internal policies. And so I'm finding just some of that is starting to open up again, and we're starting to adjust in terms of Zoom formats. But, you know, it's, whereas I used to, like a big part of my job was going out and meeting with, you know, different partners, either in large meetings or just one-on-one over coffee to get things done and talk about all these issues. That's been a lot more difficult to kind of socialize back into the work. So our day-to-day operations really kind of kept going with some modifications, but in terms of that broader regional countywide coordination, I think it's suffered quite a bit.
So it's interesting, and I can relate to that. Part of my job right now requires communicating with communities, and the traditional way of communication was in person. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, we cannot do that. And the wildfires out west, right? That's impacting local folks. However, we still need to have those meetings. In some cases, we're talking about we are required, right, as part of the collaborative process, we are required to have those meetings. And then the question is, how do we accommodate those individuals that either do not have the access to computers or access to internet to be able to have their voice heard? So it's interesting that that you know, because of COVID-19, the pandemic does come up, and it's something that we would not think about, right, in the past, and assume that if we're collaborating, we get together. And I know, for example, examples from Oregon, there are collaboratives in the town of John Day that everything took place at the local restaurant. And right now, you know, that might not be the case. So very, very challenging to have in-person meetings nowadays.
The impacts of COVID in terms of partnerships has also hurt, again, here in Arkansas, very strong state in collaborative partnerships, public, private, etc. Our nonprofits are all suffering greatly because they're not getting donations. Their fundraising mechanisms are interrupted because of hard times economically because of COVID. And I know all of you can relate to that. It's interesting that some of us are seeing actually huge benefits in terms of funding and profit, for lack of a better term, because of COVID, like Ed was talking about, the way people are working on their own yards, which is driving sales. We have our hunting and fishing license sales are up significantly. Our agency's up $2.1 million right now over where we were last year, but our nonprofits are having the opposite. And whereas, again, Nature Conservancy, White River Waterkeepers is another one that's shut down. The Nature Conservancy has had to get rid of a significant amount of their staff. So actually, whereas they have been such an important partner and actually had a lead role in so much conservation, now they're relying on us much more because they literally have lost staff and funding. And so we're seeing our partnerships have to shift in terms of leadership and take up the slack for the nonprofits. I didn't anticipate that one, you know, coming along, and it's that's actually hurt, but we're compensating. But it's just another interesting part of this pandemic.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, folks, I just want to announce we're here at the end of the session, and I would like to give you time to go around the room and get your impression of how either the session, the type of conversation, or how we move forward with collaborative approaches to conservation. And let's see, Nathan.
Well, I really appreciate the different perspectives. Like you can see by my hat, I'm from Colorado, and so I used to be on the, the other side where we were, a local conservation agency working with private landowners. But here in Southern California, if it's privately held, it's got a house on it, and so here the public landowners are really the landowners, right? Yeah. So it's just it's nice to get the different perspectives, and also I think kind of cathartic to hear from Ed too about the frustrations of working across boundaries and agencies. And so it's just, I find these conversations just helpful to kind of know that we're all kind of dealing with the same problems and, coming up with these different strategies. And so it's not a problem that's going, it's a really positive development that it's where it is. I think that there's more and more really good examples of this stuff working. But it's still nice to kind of, compare and contrast. It's one of actually my favorite things about this meeting and Natural Areas Association in general is the variety of practitioners and the, really representing across the US. So I really enjoy being part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. Kelly.
Yeah, actually, just to echo the very end of what it was just said, the idea of having space in a conference to just talk to others about what you're doing, and especially, and not only has COVID affected like the work we're doing, our conference too, right? Yes. And being able to have those in-person and informal times to talk to people, I think are super important. So having a session where you can sort of just like, yeah, what you've been doing and how's that working for you and what works and what doesn't, I think is super important. So on that level, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And yeah, I also thinking like into the future, I think COVID is providing a lot of opportunities to be innovative in what we're doing. And I think that helps too to think about, well, okay, I can kind of do this. I'm thinking about a particular thing that we did this year. We did a event, every year we do these stewardship events. Well, this year we couldn't do them because we couldn't get groups together. So we used the online platform iNaturalist to do self-guided bioblitz is what we call them. And so people were out doing observations and stuff. So thinking outside of the box and then figuring out how do you do that with others that you collaborate with. And that's kind of where I'm at right now, is trying to figure out how do I get beyond what our little ideas that we're thinking of within our program into that bigger realm. And that's with COVID, that has definitely been a challenge. So, thanks.
Ed?
From the private sector, we're doing okay primarily because of the eclectic nature of the markets that we deal in. On a positive aspect of the COVID virus, Zooming is a lot more prevalent in our life now. In fact, I know folks that are in Zoom toxicity, Zoom withdrawals, Zoom consulting. It's really having an impact. But on the other hand, I have several friends that their lives are permanently changed. They won't be going back to work as it was before. A lot of them are in the urban sector, and less travel, less traffic congestion, less air pollution, less time spent commuting, all add to a quality of life that I'm happy to say we're reacting to COVID in a way that is profound. And so I'm optimistic there. And I think our markets are going to go on growing because we're defined by ecological parameters, successive restoration, and we are limited to deal with species of plants that will survive out there with climate change and with their parameters, their niche parameters that define success or failure. And so that alone is its own market force. If drought is the issue and we're selling drought tolerant species, we don't have to market that. That's a positive force in our favor that will go on expanding good environmental technology. So I'm sitting here feeling pretty good all in all.
Thank you, Ed. Daryl?
Well put, each of you. Yeah. Greatly appreciate it. And for me, the Natural Areas Association and this conference is just what you were getting at, Kelly, and each of you. I really enjoy the diversity of this group, and so this discussion is great for me. State agency people can be some of the worst about getting into a rut of what we do, and it's great. This is such a great forum to interact with and understand private sector, nonprofits, other than agency people that we tend to be normally dominated working with. So for this session's been great just to hear from each of you and the things you deal with from your perspective. It's invaluable for a regulatory state agency person like me. And I know it is for William. The feds are even worse.
Thank you, Daryl. Carol?
Okay, there it is. Well, I just wanted to say thanks for letting me listen in on this conversation. I found it pretty inspiring. You know, some days I feel like I'm just stuck in my little house all by myself, and that I'll never really have real contact with people and good conversations. But this has been really nice, and I'm inspired about continuing collaboratives and you know, finding new and as you've said, innovative ways to keep them going during these trying times. So thanks.
Great. Thank you, Carol. Well, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for participating during the session today.